So I think it's time to start. So welcome to this webinar. It's brought to you by the two of the SLU future platforms, SLU Urban Futures and Future Forests. And this time we are having a webinar on adaptive governance of urban green spaces across Latin America insights amid COVID-19 with Dr. Martinez Cruz, that is on the Department of Forest Economics. Just a few words about the organizations that bring you this webinar. It's SLU Future Platforms, this SLU Urban Futures and Future Forests, and we promote transdisciplinary research, education, and collaboration for a sustainable future. And Future Forest is a platform for interdisciplinary forest research, collaboration, research, communication. It's a platform that it's a collaboration between SLU, Skogforsk, and Umeå University. While SLU Urban Futures is one of the strategic platforms at SLU that develops and strengthens transdisciplinary research, education, and collaboration, sustainable urban development. This webinar series is a you don't see my slides.
We do.
Ah, you do. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see. Yeah. So this webinar series started for 1 year ago, and we have a few webinars that are published, and you can see them in this web page. So just some reminders before our webinar. Just turn off your microphones, and this presentation is going to be recorded, but only the presentation, not the discussion. And then save your questions for the end of the presentation, or write them in the chat, and I will, together with Eliza, coordinate the question asking. And then next time we have a webinar is on 8th of December on the future analysis of the management of urban forests by Torgny Lind, which is the Department of Forest Resource Management. So now I will give the floor to Dr. Martinez Cruz, who will discuss how managers of urban green spaces along Latin America have adapted or not to the challenges imposed by social distancing measures, and how adaptation reflects the type of governance in these places. And then Dr. Martinez Cruz is an empirical microeconomist who primarily focuses on applications and innovations of non-market valuation methods. Urban green spaces are of particular interest for him because ecosystem services provided through urban green spaces are less prompted to be valued in comparison to those provided by more pristine ecosystems like the virgin ecosystems. Then, Adam, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dimitris.
It will be about 20-25 minutes, and then we have discussion.
Very good, very good. Actually, that's perfect time. As I said, I like to leave a space for people to ask a lot of questions. Let me share my presentation. The good thing is that everyone in the audience can see two versions of me, the pre-COVID picture and the post-COVID me, so that if you find me on the hallway of SLU, you can identify me. So yeah, I am part of the Department of Forest Economics in the campus of Umeå. And the work I am going to be presenting to you is what we believe in my colleagues and me, that is relevant for post-pandemic time for Latin America, as I will make the point. But we believe that it opens a lot of potential synergies with researchers in Europe and USA as well, everywhere else. And urban green spaces was a very important, long-standing topic of research for people in environmental psychology and environmental economics, to mention just a couple of fields. But I think that the general public was less aware of how relevant urban green spaces are. And that is particularly the case in Latin America, where actually research has also been lacking, or it has fallen behind in comparison to other areas. So there are two parts of the conversation in this presentation. I'm going to be talking about adaptive governance, and I am going to be talking about contesting views on how mobility restrictions should have been implemented amid COVID-19. So the first part of the conversation is a summary of a paper where we deal with whether and how managers in Latin America have adapted or not during COVID-19 to the challenges of implementing mobility restrictions within and in the surroundings of the urban green spaces, and whether and how that adaptation or the lack of adaptation actually reflects the type of governance that is in place. And governance of urban green spaces actually is a relatively small strand in the literature, while a lot of literature has focused on the services that urban green spaces provide, how the governance looks, particularly in Latin America, we can assure you is very much overlooked until now. Then the second part of the seminar explores the views and or opinions of urban residents on how their access to urban green spaces should have regulated during the pandemic. And for that, in doing so, we explore how the information that is posted in social media, which has a very unstructured shape, the social media is a platform where we put very unstructured conversations, and we are trying to make sense out of it. So you will see that how we are doing that, and then we believe that is part of the contribution of this research. And also it has, in the end, public policy implications. Or we are doing this research in hopes to provide public policy recommendations to increase the resilience of cities in the future social shock events, either through health, climate change. We believe that urban green spaces in Latin America, elsewhere, but our focus is on Latin America, will be very important for the resilience of the city. So we are creating this very interdisciplinary work, and that is something I want to emphasize. This is what I'm presenting is the summary of these two papers. That one of them is just coming out this week. Which has been developed together with Jaime Sainz, which is at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica de Mexico, who works in the Department of Public Administration. He's a public policy specialist. But I am highlighting the work of the rest of my colleagues in this research because they are, in this specific case, computational scientists. Without the work that they have been doing with us, this paper, for instance, would have not come out because we needed a lot of data mining strategies to come out with this paper. Second paper that I'm presenting here is based on semi-structured interviews carried out by Jaime. And again, these two papers are very interdisciplinary. And what I will be highlighting by the end of the presentation is that we are putting together this presentation with hope that we will call the attention. This will be interesting for people in other disciplines in SLU. I am an economist, in particular, I am an econometrician, and this work really falls outside my comfort zone, but we are very interested in building synergies with other disciplines. We believe but we are not sure, that landscape architects and landscape ecologists might get interested to explore further the data sets that we are analyzing and the topic in general. So I'm going to start summarizing, telling you what we did in the paper that where we explored the governance of the urban green spaces in Latin America. What we did was we went and contacted amid COVID-19. We were, if I remember correctly, in May of 2020. We contacted managers of urban green spaces across Latin America. 18 in total. We carry out 18 semi-structured interviews. When I say we, I mean mostly my colleague Jaime Sainz. With, as you can see, with a focus in from Mexico to what will be South America, but more in the north part. In the south part, we focus on Salta in Argentina, which is a relatively medium-sized city to small. But we try to cover as much experiences in Latin America as possible, not only in terms of geography, but as you can see, we are trying to identify which ones are mega cities, large cities, medium cities, and small localities or cities. We are trying to cover those 4 categories of cities in our interviews. What we did was to interview managers of urban green spaces, and then with this conceptual framework in mind, try to identify 2 things. One, whether they were able to adapt or not to the challenges, and 2, what does that reflected in terms of their governance? So for that to happen, I don't know if my daughter is about to show up. Give me just a second. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Sorry about that. My daughter was a little bit worried about a plan that got frozen. So with this, we went and had this framework in mind when we did the interviews. We realized that COVID-19 and the challenges that it represented could be seen as an exogenous intervention. Usually what happens when you try to analyze the governance of, in this particular case, how your urban green spaces is managed, is that you have to understand the governance arrangements, have to understand the characteristics of the management, but you also have to be very aware of what are the policies and planning tools that relate to the urban green space. Plus, what are the green infrastructures in the cities? And importantly, what are the social norms and overall level of compliance in a given city? All this is going on when you need or you want to understand what factors influence the decision-making of managers of urban green spaces. Now, while we were claiming, or what we claim in our paper is, in general, the green infrastructure and the social norms are fixed factors, or they are relatively fixed over a period of time, relatively long period of time. But what moves relatively fast, some of the countries, the policies related to urban green spaces, in particular the planning tools, which are heavily influenced by the budget. But what happened was, this factor during the pandemic peaks. What really was at place determining how decisions were made during the pandemic is the governance arrangement and the management characteristics. Those two factors are the ones that were influencing the decisions taken during the pandemic as the mobility restrictions were put in place. So in our paper, what we do is we analyze how the managers adapted and what that reflected. We use that adaptation as a mirror to infer and propose a categorization of how that adapted the governance of the urban green space in Latin America is, by keeping the other three factors fixed in the pandemic. Having that in mind, this is basically what we found. We found that there are four main types of governance structures in Latin America. I'm going to, they are listed in this at the bottom of this figure. The first one is what we call the public service or municipality service management governance structure. And this one is the most common in our cases, and we claim is the most common in most of Latin America. And it is basically described in the following way. This public municipality service governance is very dependable on budget constraints, and the managers of the urban green spaces in this governance structure actually have many more functions to accomplish. Usually, they have only 1% of the budget allocated to urban green spaces, and they tend to not be the most, they don't tend to put priority on their urban green spaces because, for instance, they have to use some of their budget providing other services such as lighting, public lighting. The second type of governance that we found was what we call interagency. As we move forward, you will see that as we move in this categorization, you will see that budget as measured as proportion or as money per square meter starts increasing. So the interagency receives in general more budget, among other things, because what they have is public offices in charge of the urban green spaces at different levels of government. For instance, some parks are administered in a combination between municipality agency and state agency, so they tend to receive more money. The level of specialization of the manager of these urban green spaces increases in terms of education, in terms of training, but it is still relatively low. Then we have two very important cases in Latin America. One that we call dedicated management. Dedicated management, we have parks that receive specific funding for conservation of the urban green space that usually are relatively large parks. And this money is managed by very well-trained managers that actually may have higher degrees of education, which is relatively infrequent in Mexico. And now we have what we call polycentric management. Polycentric management actually is a regional institution that puts together different municipalities and the state, coordinating the managers to make sure that several urban green spaces are taken care of. And they have the possibility to collect, negotiate, and collect more budget. Under those four types of management, what we find is that most of the non-adaptive governance is, no, the way to say it is that the public services management in general is very non-adaptive. It has non-adaptive governance because it lacks the budget, but it also lacks the skills of the manager and priority. So there are those three things that come together and make behaviors that are not adaptive the rule in those types of urban green spaces. The issue is that, according to our research, unfortunately, most of the urban green spaces in Latin America fall in that category. They are public services urban green spaces. So example of non-adaptive measures, they closed the premises completely. They didn't even consider regulated access or some kind of schedules. They closed the premises. No matter what, they were like, okay, we are going to just not allow people to come into the urban green space, which created, we will see later on in the next paper, a lot of compliance. No, is a lot of
complaints. Probably.
Complaints. Yeah. Thank you, Dimitris. I was trying to find another one. A lot of complaints because what we had was people could not enter in a given premise, but then they were walking around the premise. So in terms of contact, if we wanted to avoid the spreading, that probably was not the best way to avoid the spreading. So at some point in our paper, we mentioned how this non-adaptive behavior actually very likely plays against the goal of controlling the spreading of the COVID-19. And in the end, we will be discussing by the very end how we want to take the direction of this study. We very likely were misusing in Latin America the available green that we had in the cities. This kind of non-adaptive behavior goes against resilience of a city during this type of events. In contrast, if you see in this graph to the right, where we are listing adaptive behaviors, for instance, we had identified several cases of, for instance, dedicated management in Mexico, or where they adapted health protocols to urban green space. For instance, they diversified the way they did use tools to communicate rules. That, for instance, is very similar to some findings that that have been documented in Europe. How people were receiving the news, how urban green space managers were communicating when people could enter into the urban green space was very important, so that they didn't come and overcrowded the urban green space. Some of the urban green managers, some of the managers were using social media, and some others were using WhatsApp, for instance. Some others were using actually devices to regulate the people move within the urban green space. They were marking areas where they recommended that families could be hanging out in different centric circles so that they were not getting in contact with other families. They regulated access, and they also regulated how people were hanging out inside the urban green space. They were learning how to adapt by using neighborhood networks to communicate rules, and how those rules were changing, and the rationale of how those rules, why those rules were changing. Because something that was important in this particular interview was that they realized that if they were going to be changing weekly the rules of accessing, people were complaining. But if they were good at communicating the reasoning behind the changes, people will be less, people were more willing to participate and collaborate. So we have, for sure, the non-adaptive behavior that unfortunately, most of the urban green spaces in Latin America seem to have followed this non-adaptive behavior. But at the same time, we have very adaptive behavior in Latin America. Interestingly enough, we mostly observe adaptive behavior, dedicated management, urban green spaces, and in polycentric management. But thankfully, there were some public managed urban green spaces that also had the possibility to adapt. There, the key, you may be guessing, was leadership of the manager and education and skills. So we identified that a few public urban green spaces had the good luck of having people who were very well trained. And that, for instance, one of our public policy implications and one of our recommendations is that we identified that some of these public managers actually did not receive their training formally, or they didn't arrive formally trained to their position, but they took advantage of network in Latin America, where they get access to information, up-to-date information. So it seems that a good recommendation for the case of Mexico or Colombia is that public officials should be engaging and should receive the funding to engage in the network that will keep them up to date, that will increase their skills. That's one of the public policy recommendations that we suggested. Let me go further so that I also tell you now about the second paper. What we say in the previous paper, or in the one that I just described to you briefly, is, as I am an economist, the way I see it is the supply side of the equation. How the supplier of ecosystem services provided by urban green spaces, how the manager behaved during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we were very interested also on the demand side, but the demand side was a little bit more tricky, right? We considered doing semi-structured interviews as well, but we thought it will not represent too much of what we wanted. So what we did was, with the help of our colleagues in computation algorithms, was we downloaded the messages posted in Twitter by people in Latin America. Then, through machine learning, we carry out a classification by country using a text classification algorithm. And what we did was we identified two types of opinions or views. Those tweets or messages that reflected that they were in favor of how mobility restrictions were implemented and that they were implemented, that we call reflecting a positive opinion about it. And then we have the ones that reflect negative opinion about it, that either they were not in favor, they were also complaining about what was happening in terms of regulations of mobility within and surrounding the urban green spaces. So we were able to check the evolution of the two types of views. One we call denouncing of non-compliance, and the other one demanding of access to urban green spaces. We were able to do this for Spain, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, because they are the ones with the most Twitter usage in Latin America. We use Spain as a kind of reference point because arguably we share a few cultural features with Spain in Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. So we were able to track the evolution of the views. Now, something I want to highlight in these four graphs is the first kind of finding, which is in a given day during the pandemic, by the way, not during the entire pandemic, that is something I should have said, we focused on tweets posted from February to August, end of August, until the week 40, actually, there. Every day you see both. You see the people who are not very happy about how the regulation is implemented and the people who are actually okay with it. So the thing that I want to start pointing out is the topics. We were very interested on analyzing what topics were coming out in the messages. We were expecting, for instance, that mental health and COVID-related mentions were going to be the biggest topic. Why? Because of the literature pointing out that, you know, we are missing urban green spaces because of the services that they provide in terms of mental health and physical health. The truth is, in the 4 countries across the period that we analyzed, the least mentioned directly were the topics of mental health and COVID-19 related issues. What we came to realize is that people were mentioning children and sports. Those 2 topics were very important in Latin America. And what we realized when we went to do, because in this paper we carry out also, we pick messages and we analyze the verbatim messages. What we came to realize is that people were not comfortable talking directly about the need of urban green spaces for mental health concerns, but they will subsume the topic under children use, or basically they will call for the opening of urban green spaces for the sake of children. And then later on, they will add and mental health, or for the mental health of children. But it's very interesting to see, at least for us, that as much as we as researchers know the relevance of urban green spaces for mental health, the urban residents were not discussing it in those terms. They were discussing it for the sake of children, and they were mentioning the need to carry out sports, particularly in Argentina. That big blue that you see there is they were asking for their soccer fields to be open, clearly. And you can see also that in Mexico, we also care about soccer fields. But other than that, it was either sports or for the children use. Mental health was not their main topic in their tweets. That was for us a very interesting finding. Now, for me to leave a space to receive questions, something that we wanted to check was, what is the association between denouncing or being unhappy about mobility restrictions and the restrictions themselves? For that, what we did was we ran a very simple economic statistical model where we associate percentage of tweets that reflect the nouns view and the strength of the restrictions. And then we run it on what is called rolling window. For every 20 weeks, we estimate how that association was observed. And then here we are basically graphing the evolution of that association. Something very interesting that comes out is that if you consider the confidence interval, the 95% confidence interval of the association in Spain, you can see that association is never different from 0. Basically meaning people were, you don't find an association between how strong was the mobility restriction and how much the announcing was. And something similar happens in Argentina. Most of the period, the association is zero, statistically speaking. When we go into the details of the tweets and we analyze verbatim, what we realize, and we analyze also the evolution, one of the first graphs, what we realize is that the reason why there is no association here in Spain is basically because when people were complaining more or denouncing more when the mobility restrictions were decreased. And they were complaining less when the mobility restrictions were increased. So somehow we say people in Spain were kind of following the strength of the restrictions. In contrast, in Argentina, what we observe in the evolution and in the verbatim analysis is that the announcing was the main denominator through the entire period of analysis. They were denouncing, they were complaining even before there were restrictions, strong restrictions on the mobility. And they kept complaining about it through the entire time. So there is no association because the complaining basically remained fixed through the entire time in proportion. That is different to what we observe in Colombia and Mexico. In Colombia and Mexico, by the week 30 to the 50 to the 40, during 10 weeks or half of the period of analysis, what we observe is a strong association between the announcing and level of an increase on the strength of the restrictions. And these two associations basically were reflected was in Mexico and in Colombia, and I know the case of Mexico because I was following the case a lot. For those that don't know, I am from Mexico, so that's why I was so interested in the Mexican case. The more strict the restrictions were, the less people were complying. That is basically what this is reflecting. In Colombia and Mexico, it seems that the more they try to restrict behavior, the less successful they were in doing it. That's why there is so much denounce on lack of compliance. And we find that this is reflecting a strong demand for urban green spaces that goes against the way that it was managed in those two countries. So I'm about to finalize with the following. Where we are going, and again, I am going to emphasize, hopefully with the help of an interdisciplinary group of colleagues, we were able to gather recently data on mobility from cell phones in Latin America, in several cities of Latin America. So the next step is to actually find association between mobility and available green areas, plus controlling for the restrictions that were implemented in each city. And we want to know, one of our intentions coming from the previous research is that the more the strength of the restrictions, the more people in Mexico and Colombia were using urban green spaces. And more likely, the more transmission was occurred. That is one of the lines of research we want to carry out. The second one, and this is where finally the economist of me is coming out. There is really no theoretical guidance on how to balance the trade-off that managers of urban green spaces face during the COVID-19, because they all of a sudden were in charge of balancing the demand to satisfy, to provide ecosystem services that support mental and physical health, but at the same time they had to balance the need to the demand to not increase the spread of the virus. And there is really no theoretical guidance that we believe that they are aware and that we believe that is somewhere. The economists, thankfully, we have something that we call production frontier analysis. And basically, we will be trying to propose that approach to guide the decision of how urban green spaces should be managed and administered in the future, considering the views of the residents, of course. Because our departure point for that theoretical paper will be that based on what we have documented in the previous two papers, it seems clear that the urban green spaces in Latin America were not used the best that they could have been used to provide services at the same time that we control for the spread of the virus. And indeed, that result most likely doesn't hold only for Latin America. With differences, I think that it holds also somewhere else in Europe, in USA. So I think that that theoretical paper will have a very interesting audience, but that theoretical paper has to be translated into an empirical one, and the translation into the empirical one requires conversations with landscape architects and landscape ecologists who will tell us about the ecosystem services that urban green spaces actually provide, because we as economists, or my colleague as a public policy expert, we are not experts on the specifics of the ecosystem service. One last point is, we are very aware that urban green spaces, as well as remote working, will be key for the post-pandemic time. And here is where I come as a non-market valuation economist. We are aiming to estimate what is the option value of the current urban green spaces. Now, more than ever, it seems a very good idea that in Latin American cities, we keep our green spaces, which is something that I don't know if you know, but that tends to not be the priority in Mexico City and other big cities in Latin America. So with that, I stop, and I thank you for the invitation. I thank you for staying here through the presentation, and I'm looking forward for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, very much. It was really, really interesting, and I was thinking mostly of my country, Greece, that I think it would be in the same situation as Colombia and Mexico, that the more the restrictions, the less people were following this. But I was surprised about Spain, that they really followed what the government was saying. So it's yeah.
I also was a little bit surprised by Spain, eh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it seems that the data suggests it. And also when we were reading the verbatim post, people were kind of agreeing with what was going on. So we were surprised. I'm glad we use them as reference point for Latin America.
Yeah, sure. Okay, now we open